Good evening, peoples. I'm Pastor Leia, and Gingersnap is somewhere in the kitchen still snacking. I just went in to tell her that it's live stream time, and she's decided no, it is still dinner time. So welcome back to our living room for our series on the non-canonical Gospels, the books that didn't make it into this book for reasons that are sometimes blatantly obvious. So tonight we are looking at the Syriac Infancy Gospel, so called because it was probably originally written in the Syriac language. Are you coming over here? We're just gonna sit and look at me. Okay. It's also sometimes known as the Arabic Infancy Gospel because when European readers first encountered it, it was from an Arabic version that was published in like 16 something. So the oldest surviving manuscript, which is written in Arabic, I think there's two of them in different pieces, but they date to the 13th and 16th century, so pretty recent in the scheme of things. But scholars think that the original might have been written as early as the 6th century. It can be hard to tell with these things because, of course, we don't have originals of anything in the Bible. It's got some pretty clear influence from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of James, and the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew that we've already looked at. There's also some influence from the Quran, which is really interesting and not something I'm super qualified to get into much detail on, but definitely interesting. Turn off my space heater there. So, from the Syriac Infancy Gospel. Once upon a time. The following accounts we found in the book of Joseph the high priest, called by some Caiaphas. He relates that Jesus spake even when he was in the cradle, and said to his, yes, he spoke, and spoke to his mother, Mary, I am Jesus, the Son of God, that word which thou didst bring forth according to the declaration of the angel Gabriel to thee, and my Father hath sent me for the salvation of the world. This is a 17th or 18th century translation for public domain reasons, so of course Jesus spake. But the day he was born, Jesus spoke to his mother in this version of the story. Oh, also, of course, Gingersnap's now sitting in front of it, but this is my Christmas sweater with Jesus in a party hat. This is birthday boy, speaking of his birth. So Joseph is born in a cave, as we've seen in some of the other non-canonical books, and Joseph rushes off to find a midwife, which is pretty helpful of him, I think. So the book continues, it was after sunset, when the old woman and Joseph with her reached the cave, and they both went into it. And behold, it was all filled with lights, greater than the light of lamps and candles, and greater than the light of the sun itself. The infant was then wrapped up in swaddling clothes, and sucking the breasts of his mother, Saint Mary. When they both saw this light, they were surprised. The old woman asked Saint Mary, Art thou the mother of this child? Saint Mary replied, She was. On which the old woman said, Thou art very different from all other women. Saint Mary answered, As there is not any child like to my son, so neither is there any woman like to his mother. Which, so sassy, I love it. So then there's a scene with shepherds and angels that we are familiar with, and then it continues, and I really love this verse. And as the shepherds were engaged in the same employment, glorifying God, the cave at that time seemed like a glorious temple, because both the tongues of angels and men united to adore and magnify God on account of the birth of the Lord Christ. I think that's really lovely that a random place out in nature becomes a temple because it is filled with voices praising God. That's a really lovely image. And again, we've seen before the unnatural light coming out of this dark cave because Jesus is the light of the world, and that's some pretty cool symbolism. From chapter 2, and when the time of his circumcision was come, namely the 8th day, on which the law commanded the child to be circumcised, they circumcised him in the cave. So fun fact, the 8th day of Christmas, or the octave of Christmas, is celebrated in some traditions as the circumcision of Jesus, and so it's holy day of obligation in the Catholic Church, and it happens to fall on January 1st. And it's kind of personally hilarious to me that a number of the Catholics in my life refer to New Year's Day as the holy day of obligation. It's nothing to do with the New Year or the fact that it's January 1st. It's because it's 8 days. It's the 8th day of Christmas. Oh, merry 11th day of Christmas tonight, by the way. Oh, and also... Sorry, I keep getting sidetracked. Public service announcement every year. Please stop putting partridges in pear trees. They are a ground nesting bird. They do not want to be in a pear tree. Leave them where you found them. Don't harass the partridges. Anyway, so Jesus is circumcised in the cave, and the old Hebrew woman took the foreskin, others say she took the navel string, and preserved it in an alabaster box of old oil of spikenard. And she had a son who was a druggist, to whom she said, "Take heed thou sell not this alabaster box of spikenard ointment, although thou shouldst be offered 300 pence for it." Now, this is that alabaster box which Mary the sinner procured, and poured forth the ointment out of it upon the head and the feet of our Lord Jesus Christ, and wiped them off with the hairs of her head. I think it's really interesting that the author himself isn't quite sure if it's the foreskin or the navel string. And I'm not entirely sure why this particular alabaster box of perfume would then be used on Jesus later. But anyway, so there isn't any historical evidence at all that people in this time and culture would have saved foreskins or umbilical cords, but it may be in the story because by the time this gospel was written, relics were increasingly important in Christian culture. So a relic is an object that formerly belonged to a saint or is literally part of a saint or that came into contact with saints. So that might be like a skull or a rosary or a piece of clothing or something that a saint had like blessed in their life. So some relics are pretty well documented, especially from the last couple centuries, but many, especially in the Middle Ages, have kind of dubious origins. So there were quite a few churches that might claim to have the bones of a particularly popular saint. There was, which one, he had like 3 or 4 heads across Europe, apparently. Throughout history, there have been between 8 and 18 foreskins allegedly belonging to Jesus that various churches claimed to have. I think the idea, and I'm not from a tradition that puts a lot of importance on relics, so I'm not the expert here. I think the idea is supposed to be that Jesus' physical body ascended into heaven after his resurrection. So there's no physical body here. But because he'd been circumcised 8 days after birth, foreskin was not part of his physical body anymore, so it would have been left behind. Obviously, no church could claim to have like Jesus' skull for obvious reasons. He ascended into heaven, but theoretically, a church could be in possession of his foreskin, except that would never have been saved at the time. And if you would ask me in seminary whether I ever planned to do a church live stream about Jesus' penis, I would have laughed at you. And yet here we are. Anyway, here's a fun story appropriate for the week of Epiphany. And it came to pass, when the Lord Jesus was born at Bethlehem, a city of Judea, in the time of Herod the king, the wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, according to the prophecy of Zoroaster. This is the only book that brings Zoroaster into this story, which is an interesting detail, and brought with them offerings, namely gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and worshipped him, and offered to him their gifts. Then the Lady Mary took one of his swaddling clothes in which the infant was wrapped, and gave it to them instead of a blessing, which they received from her as a most noble present. And at the same time there appeared to them an angel in the form of that star which had before been their guide in their journey, the light of which they followed till they returned to their own country. On their return, their kings and princes came to them inquiring whom had they seen and done, what sort of journey and return they had, what company they had on the road. But they produced the swaddling cloth, which St. Mary had given them, on account whereof they kept a feast. And having, according to the custom of their country, made a fire, they worshipped it. And casting the swaddling cloth into it, the fire took it and kept it. And when the fire was put out, they took forth the swaddling cloth unhurt, as much as if the fire had not touched it. Then they began to kiss it, and put it upon their heads and their eyes, saying, "This is certainly an undoubted truth, and it is really surprising that the fire could not burn it and consume it." Yes, it's very surprising. And then they took it, and with the greatest respect, laid it among their treasures. So, Jesus had a magic diaper. That's a thing. It's a thing that the writer or writers of this gospel thought was important enough to write down to preserve for posterity. I literally cannot overstate how little experience I have in this arena. I've spent very little time with babies. But it would have been pretty standard for a woman of Mary's generation, and long before for a big chunk of history, to wrap a baby up snugly in bands of cloth, sometimes also translated as bandages. So there might have been something like a diaper underneath, or that area might have just been left uncovered in a warm climate, or the swaddling clothes themselves might just have been rinsed and dried every night. But what's interesting here is that Mary gave one of her son's diapers to the Magi, because that's obviously a very common party favor to give to a guest at a baby shower. I've never been to a baby shower in person, can you tell? And then the Magi threw it in a fire, which seems understandable to me. But in this case, I think it's supposed to be like an act of veneration or maybe sacrifice. The custom of their country, I'm a little vague. But the diaper doesn't burn because, like, this isn't just any piece of fabric. It touched Jesus. It's kind of bewildering to me, to be honest. But you know how I mentioned that a whole bunch of medieval churches claimed to have the foreskin of Jesus? Yes. Yes, there was a church who claimed to have his diaper. Except actually, it would be more accurate to say that there is a church who claims to have his diaper. It's in Croatia. I think they only display like every 7 or so years, but I think that like the translation of the Croatian into English, like in the museum displays, like does say diaper rather than swaddling cloth, which is interesting translation choice. Anyway, so that's a thing that if you ever go to Croatia, you could maybe see. Anyway, while Jesus is still in diapers, and yes, this is an increasingly weird evening that we are having here, the Holy Family escapes Herod by fleeing to Egypt. That part is, in this Bible. So one interesting scene from that chapter of the story involves Jesus healing and exorcising the son of an Egyptian priest while Jesus himself is still a baby. And then 2 adult women are healed and exorcised when they take Jesus from his mother's arms and kiss him. I feel like if I encountered a woman who was like possessed or very ill, I would not hand her my baby, but whatever. It's Jesus, he's a special case. So then like multiple other individuals are healed of leprosy by taking baby Jesus's bath water and pouring it on themselves. There were at least 3. There may have been a few more than that. But what's really wild here is that there are quite a few other miracles involving baby Jesus and toddler Jesus, and they are jaw-droppingly wild. I cannot even, to use a millennialism, there is literally a vampire, and it is not even the weirdest scene. You might think that I'm joking, and I am not. There's a vampire, and anyway. So Jesus grows up a bit, and we again get the story of Jesus bringing clay sparrows to life, which will never not be delightful. I do really like that story. There's also a whole chapter about Joseph being a bad carpenter, and he keeps making things like very much the wrong size, but Jesus like touches them and miraculously fixes his mistakes, which I'm really curious why that needed to make it into the story, that Joseph was an incompetent carpenter. Like, is it just to be funny? Is it just like another example of miracles? I don't know, but anyway. So then when Jesus is 12, we again get the story of Jesus staying behind in the temple and talking with the priests and scholars there. But in this gospel, he astonishes everyone with his like encyclopedic knowledge of literally every subject. He knows the position of every star, and he like knows everything about the human body and like philosophy and just like everything, and he's just like spouting out all of these facts, and like the experts in these fields are just, how does this kid know all of this? I've spent my whole life studying, and this kid knows more than I do, which would be rather awkward, I would imagine. So then the book concludes, and now from this time, Jesus began to conceal his miracles and secret works, and gave himself to the study of the law till he arrived to the end of his 30th year, at which time the Father publicly owned him at Jordan, sending down this voice from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The Holy Ghost being also present in the form of a dove, probably not wearing a festive winter scarf, but dove. This is he whom we worship with all reverence, because he gave us our life and being and brought us from our mother's womb, who for our sakes took a human body and hath redeemed us, that so he might embrace us with everlasting mercy and shew his free, large, bountiful grace and goodness to us. To him be glory and praise and power and dominion from henceforth and forevermore. Amen. So it's especially appropriate to close with this story referencing Jesus' baptism and the voice of God coming down and saying, "This is my Son, whom I love," because this Sunday we celebrate the feast of the baptism of the Lord, which comes after Epiphany every year. So I think this is a really interesting and cool ending to the story. So like the Jesus of our canonical Gospels does some truly amazing things. I mean, the water and the wine and the coming back from the dead and all the healing and amazing things. But they're not the sorts of like magical feats and like fantasy movie action sequences that we find in this apocryphal Syriac Infancy Gospel. And the stories in this book would be unbelievable to most readers, such as, for example, myself. But because of that, the author emphasizes, okay, look, I know how this sounds, but we have physical evidence of all this. I really love that. But then to explain how the young Jesus of this gospel, who just does wow when he's a baby, is healing things and talking, but then how that Jesus grows up into the somewhat quieter and more chill adult Jesus of the Bible that we read. So the author has him conceal his miracles and start to act kind of like everyone else, to be a bit more under the radar. So in other words, Superman puts on his glasses, calls himself Clark Kent, and is absolutely, definitely, for sure, a perfectly normal male human who was born on the planet Earth and certainly isn't in any way an alien with super strength who crash landed on our planet as a baby. I just always have to fit the comic book references into these things, apparently. So anyway, the Syriac Infancy Gospel is full of really interesting stories. And again, I left out some of the weirdest parts. Superhero stories have always been a popular genre, like literal superheroes like Superman and Captain America, etc., but also like the great knights of the Middle Ages who fought dragons, etc., and Beowulf, and all these characters kind of could be described as superheroes. And that's always been a popular genre because we like to imagine what we could do if we had superpowers. Like, what if we could fly? Or what if we could talk to animals? Or what if our eyeballs could shoot lasers? Or what if we could win in one-to-one combat with a dragon? Jesus is very powerful, like in this particular story and also in our Bibles, and the Jesus that we do believe in, he's very powerful. And in some ways you could describe him as like literally an actual superhero. But why didn't he use his powers more or more dramatically? One of my friends once asked, like, how does Jesus sleep when there are more sick and injured people in the world that he could be healing? Like, why is that? But then also, like, at what point did his powers come into being? As an adult, when he began his ministry, when he became a man, were they there from the very beginning? And if they were, what would it look like for a newborn baby to have literally all the powers of God? So non-canonical gospels and Christian legends have tried for thousands of years to answer these questions. I don't think that very much of this particular book fits with my own understanding of who Jesus is, but I think it was written by someone genuinely interested in understanding Jesus and sharing his story, and I think that's pretty cool. Also, it's just a great story. So I think this concludes our series on the weird gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. There are more. We don't have existing copies of some of them. Like a lot of early church authors would reference books that we no longer have, which is such a frustration for scholars. Anyway, so I hope that you've found this series as fun as I have. It's been an interesting look into the questions that Christians have been asking since the very beginning of what we now know of as the church. So, friends, what should we cover next? Comment below if you have a suggestion. So thanks for making it this far through some truly bizarre and weird stories. And until next time, good night from me and presumably from Gingersnap, who has gone back for more food, even though I fed her early so that she could be a part of this live stream. There is no reasoning with cats. So, good night.